Okay. Hi everyone. A warm welcome to our audience here in the UK, and from what I've seen on the register of attendees from many other places around the world. My name is Simon Bentley. I am chairman of Yad Vashem UK Foundation. I have pleasure in introducing Mala Tribich, who will be in conversation with her nephew, Maurice Helfgott. They are our friends who I and all of us here at Yad Vashem UK have known for many years. We are privileged to be given the opportunity of hearing from Mala, who was liberated by the British Army from Bergen-Belsen in April 1945. Mala will be telling us about her childhood life before the war, her traumatic wartime experiences, and her brave attempts to rebuild her life after the devastation of the war. Today, Mala is an inspirational educator, teaching audiences of all ages about the dangers of unchecked anti-Semitism, race hatred, and dehumanization. Mala and Maurice, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed for that very warm welcome, Simon, and thank you to you and to your committee for all that Yad Vashem does and for hosting this particular event. Now, normally when I interview somebody, I try to channel my best David Frost and my best impression of Emily Maitlis, but Mala, you are my auntie Mala. I've known you all my life. I love you, I admire you, and I'm completely biased. So I apologize to you if I'm going to be a little more pushy than I would normally be. And I'm certainly going to apologize to the audience because I can in no way be an independent interviewer. So Mala, you were born Mala Helfgott on the 24th of September, 1930 in Piotrków Trybunalski in Poland. 10 years later, in the summer of 1939, before the Germans invaded Poland, can you tell us a little bit about what your life was like and what your family was like in that summer?
Well, I come from a place called Piotrków in Poland, a small town, a very pretty town with quite a large Jewish population. When I say large, they were 15,000 out of 55,000. And before the war, my life was very happy in a loving family. There were 3 of us. I was the middle child, and with an older brother, Ben. Maurice,
I met him all my life.
Yeah, you've known him all your life, of course, yes.
Love and admire him too.
And my younger sister, Lucia. We also had, there were actually, I was a Helfgott, and there were 2 Helfgott families and 2 Klein families. That was my mother's maiden name. And so we had cousins, although all these other 3 families had only 1 child each. It was, I think it was quite fashionable to have small families then. It became fashionable. And so we had cousins to play with. I did all the ordinary things that children did in those days. I really can't pump it up to something fantastic like children have today. It's very different, but it was a very happy life. I went to school, I went to friends, we played, we visited family. And although a lot of the family is brothers and sisters of my parents lived in different towns, we did visit, we did travel, we visit our family. And just overall, life was very happy before the war. And then on the 1st of September, everything changed.
So when what happened on the 1st of September, or indeed on the 2nd of September 1939, was that your hometown, Piotrków Trybunalski, was bombed by the Luftwaffe in one of the first actions of the Second World War. What happened when the bombs fell?
Well, I remember a terrible commotion in the street. and there was bombing. We all ran to a sort of semi-basement because we lived in a flat. Most people lived in flats in Poland, unless they lived in the country, in a village. So I remember taking shelter with my family in a semi-basement, and there was someone actually lived there, but it was quite a large area in the corridor. And I remember this man was outside because he came in wounded, and I could see that as he was walking, there were signs of blood. I think he was wounded in the leg. And there was terrible commotion, and the first thing we did was run, as they would call it. My parents decided to leave Piotrków and go east. I think the idea was good. I don't really know exactly what they had in mind. Ben is the one who would know better. But they were hoping perhaps to go to Russia. We hadn't gone very
Away
far.
from the Germans.
Sorry?
Away from the Germans.
Away from the Germans. We hoped to avoid them. But we hadn't gone very far. We stopped in a town called Sulejów, a very small town. And because we met my father's brother, they were also escaping, and lots of other people we knew. And we decided to stop there for the night. But the next day, when we thought we were fairly safe and it was quiet, was a beautiful day, the sun was shining, and suddenly the bombing started. It was so unexpected and it was so severe that practically the whole town was demolished. There was only the house we were in and the school that remained, very little else. And we were all in danger, really, but my mother actually stood at the door. People wanted to run, but bombing was in full flow. So she advised them against it. When the bombing stopped, we quickly ran to the nearest forest. And then the next day we came back, and ultimately my parents decided to go back to Piotrków. There was no point in running because the Germans would get wherever we're going before us. So we couldn't avoid them. And we went back to Piotrków.
And in fact, the Germans took control of that part of Poland, because that part of Poland is on the border with Germany. So they took control very quickly. And by October, orders were issued for the establishment of the first ghetto for Jews in Poland, which was in Piotrków. And what happened there when you were ordered to, your family, your parents and your brother were ordered to go into the ghetto?
Now, yes, you're right. It was the first ghetto actually to be established in Poland. It was a prototype of what was to follow. And within 2 months of the beginning of the war, by the 1st of November, we had already been forced out of our home and into the ghetto. Of our homes, I mean, this happens to all of us. And since our population, I mentioned before, my Jewish population was 15,000, but at its height, the ghetto had 28,000. It was overcrowded, even 15,000, but 28,000 made it so overcrowded that there could be as many as 10 people to a room, 3 families to a room. And the reason it became so overcrowded is that the space between the German border and our town, all along the border, was immediately annexed, and it became part of Germany. So it obviously had to be made what they called Judenfrei, free of Jews. And some people were deported to our ghetto, some people came of their own accord because they either knew someone or they had family. And we were very densely populated in a very small area, with conditions became absolutely terrible.
So you were a young girl, 10 years old. You lived with your family and lots of other people in a cramped space in the cramped ghetto. And what your father, I know, he started to try at the beginning to trade with Poles outside the ghetto to try to make a living and get some provisions.
Yes, and it was all
You
very...
played a role in that very, very, very early on, didn't you? Your father needed to get a message outside the ghetto to
Yes.
somebody he was dealing with, but your mother didn't think it was a very good idea.
No, she really didn't want him to do it. But I was very willing to go. So I was quite adventurous. And what happened, I don't usually tell that story, so that's something, but it's interesting because I walked there, got out of the ghetto, out of some small hole somewhere. And I got to this farm outside Piotrków, and they welcomed me, gave me a glass of milk. We sat for a little while, and I gave them the message that I brought for them. And I was going back to the ghetto, but they said to me, "Look, we're going to the ghetto because we're going with the merchandise. We'll give you a lift." And this was a cart and a couple of horses, a big cart and lots of sacks of flour and other provisions. And I was sitting on this cart, and on the way we were stopped by some gendarmes, we call them, the Gestapo. They were patrolling all the time. And they started asking the men what they're doing, who they are, who I am. Well, I immediately defended myself by saying that I don't know anything about these people. I just got a lift because I was walking, and then they very kindly gave me a lift. And they said, "Okay, well then you can go." And off I went. They were arrested. The merchandise was confiscated. And I got back into the ghetto by myself safely. But that was a very near thing. It could have been
safe but terrified. Safe but terrified.
Terrified, very terrified. I mean, to be faced with these German soldiers with their rifles was no small thing.
And to what extent do you think it was the fact that you were a young girl with blonde hair and blue eyes? Did they not realize you were Jewish?
I'm sure they didn't realize I was Jewish, because if they thought I was Jewish, they wouldn't have let me go. But I sort of, I was terrified, I have to tell you. I thought I was going to be arrested. But they just took my word for it, and off I went.
So the ghetto, and I've been there with you and Dad, your brother Ben, in Piotrków, and it's in the center of the town, in the old town. A corner of the town was cut off, and the Jews were stuffed in like sardines to that bit. At the beginning, the walls of the ghetto were quite open, and over time, the walls became tighter and tighter. The conditions worsened. There was disease. There was, and then the Germans started calling names and sending people from the ghetto out to be exterminated. And at that point, your father was very concerned to try to do something to try and see what he could do to protect your life. And he had relationships with Poles of German origin who lived outside the town. So he went to see them, and what happened then?
Well, that was before the deportations, when we knew that they were coming. We didn't know when, but everybody was in panic of what's going to happen. We were all going to be deported, and we knew where to. It wasn't going to be a labor camp or anything. It was going to be places like Treblinka or Majdanek, Sobibor, where people just went there to be gassed. There was no work there.
And there were rumors. You knew that this was happening.
There were rumors, but some of them, but we had very good information that this was going to happen. It was pretty definite. Anyway, we were terribly frightened, and people tried to save themselves. Well, in all different ways. Some people managed to escape and from the ghetto and hide in sewers or in forests in the open. But my father, as you said, was introduced to someone who was not only Christian, but he was actually of German origin in a town called Częstochowa. And this man was prepared to hide 2 Jewish girls at a price. He was going to be paid for it. It was a business. So I still remember vividly when this man came with his sister-in-law who was smuggled into the ghetto so that we could, so arrangements could be made, and of course they could collect their money in advance. All that was organized, and he said that he will come back for me next week and for my cousin the week after. And those were his conditions, because my aunt and uncle, the Kleins, and Auntie Dora and Uncle Joseph, were very worried. My cousin Ija was an only child. I was one of 3, and they were desperate to try and save her. But he stuck to his guns, and it all happened. He collected meat, then he came back. There's so many details about the journey and what it was like, because even the journey itself by train was very scary, because they were always on the lookout for Jews. And there was actually a reward for saving Jews. So some of them made it quite a lucrative business. And
for saving Jews or for catching Jews? I didn't hear you.
There was the people who would turn in a Jew would be paid for it.
Yes, they weren't saving Jews. They were
not saving. No. They would turn them into the Gestapo, and they were paid for it.
And what was it like then, living in hiding? You're now 11 years old, 12 years old.
Yeah,
you're living in hiding.
I was
cousin
12
in this farm.
Actually, I'm just trying to remember the exact. She was 10 and I was 11. And Ija was 10 and I was 11. I wasn't 12 yet. But I was approaching 12. And we arrived there, this house we were staying in a house, his mother-in-law and father-in-law. He was the son-in-law, and the 2 of us were very scared and very vulnerable. We were supposed to be relatives who had come to stay from Warsaw, but sometimes when there was a knock on the door, it was okay for us to mix. Other times they would sort of push us under the bed into a cupboard anywhere out of sight. So we never knew what the next minute will bring, whether we'll have to hide, whether we'll be free, whether we'll be okay. And we were there for a little while. My cousin Ija, who, as I said, was an only child, was so terribly upset and scared. We were very vulnerable. So, and she was really terrified. Also, being an only child, she missed her parents so much, she couldn't bear it. She asked to be taken back. She was told that she can't because the deportations are still going on. And she said that her parents have very good friends in Piotrków who are hiding their valuables. They will take her in. And the men said, okay, off they went. I was still languishing there for what seemed like a lifetime. Eventually, my time came to go. The time went to go back. We were to meet in a flour mill, which before the war belonged to my father with partners. Now he was lucky to have a job there. Now, when we arrived, we met at this big storeroom, and there was my father waiting, and also my uncle, Joseph Klein. My uncle looked at us and he went white. He said, "Where's my daughter?" And the man said, "I brought her back. I took her to your friends." He mentioned the name. And he said, "But she's not with them. Where is she? What have you done with my child?" And I remember vividly my uncle with his hands behind his back, looking at the ground, pacing there and back, saying, "What have you done with my child?" And this is the end of the story. Nobody knows till this day what happened.
So it was really, it was his story that he took her back, but it was never corroborated.
No, I've got a little more that came later, which is that my aunt told me afterwards. My uncle was arrested with a lot of other people in prison, then taken to the Jewish cemetery. They were all shot. My father was among them and another uncle, but they released some people, but Ija's father was shot in the cemetery. My aunt told me after the war that apparently he did come with Ija to these very good friends. They collected a suitcase full of valuables and he left with Ija and the suitcase. She even told me a detail like this lady said and she was a very good friend of theirs. She said she helped them with the suitcase down the path and they left. And that's the end of the story.
It's a very, very, very chilling tale.
And my aunt, who was so broken-hearted over it, after the war, we hardly ever talked about it. It was too painful. But occasionally she said something. And because not knowing what happened to her, she had all sorts of different imaginations. She just, one day she said to me, "My Ija had to go into the gas chamber by herself. There was nobody to hold her hand." And she said other things, and she lived with that pain for the rest of her life. But she was always a lovely aunt towards me, and I think towards the end of her life, she imagined that I was Ija, which is something she said, but I won't go into details. But she was a lovely aunt till the end.
I want to move us on through the experience because I'm very conscious how pressed we are for time.
Oh yeah.
Your mum and your sister Lucia were taken in December 1942 to the Great Synagogue in Piotrków. They were incarcerated there for a number of days, and then they were taken out to the forest with 500 others, Jews, and they were shot. And I know from Dad that he has explained that your dad was able to find a way to get your mum out, but she was not prepared to leave your youngest sister, Lucia, to face death on her own.
They found that it was a terrible...
Did you know, as a 12-year-old child, did you know very clearly that your mother and your sister had been shot? Did you know it straight away?
That they will be, you know, when I was...
They were.
After
it happened, did you know straight away?
Yes, the very next day. Because there were people who saw it, who witnessed it, who came to tell us exactly what happened. But it's very well documented because in many books, because this was a sort of killing that was taking place all over Europe, in all the different countries. The biggest of those was in Babi Yar, where they killed several thousand people. In this case, it was 520. I just shudder when I think of how.
So you were a 12-year-old girl. You've lost your mother and your sister. Your father and your brother were surviving by working in the glass factory, which was effectively forced labor in the camp, and you found yourself responsible, amazingly, from a 5-year-old girl.
Yeah.
Tanya.
Well, I'll very quickly tell you that.
How did that happen?
Yeah.
That you are so alone yourself, so young, and you are then responsible for someone even younger.
So my aunt, one of the Helfgott aunts, was rounded up to be sent away to some camp. That was after the deportation, but they were still rounding people up, and she was taken away screaming, "Who will look after my child?" She had a 5-year-old daughter, and by then I was the only female member of the Helfgott family left. I was 12, she was 5, and I looked after her.
But when you say you looked after her, Marla, try and give us a sense of it. You're 12, you cooked for her, you washed her clothes, you gave her moral support. What you looked after in every sense? You were effectively her mum?
Yeah, absolutely. There was no one else. But life was so unnatural in those days. It's the sort of households we had. We didn't have a kitchen to cook in, and we hardly had a bed to sleep in. But in the same way as I would maybe prepare something or get some food or some bread, sometimes I managed to cook something, she would be just part of the family. There were 4 of us, but that was just before the ghetto was liquidated, and afterwards we were transferred to a labor camp. But before that, they emptied the ghetto of all the people, because I was among the illegals. I didn't have a work permit. I wasn't supposed to be there. I was supposed to be in the deportations, in those numbers. So they knew that some people were still around. They emptied they searched and searched. Before the men were transferred to their 2 different camps, there were, sorry, I sometimes just lose my trend.
That's okay, it's very clear.
They emptied the ghetto, that was the small ghetto, as we called it, and I was among them. We were outside to be deported. I was standing in a column with, I don't know how many people there were. It wasn't a very long column, and lorries were coming, picking us up and taking people away. I was towards the end of this column, and it was all very scary, and they were surrounded by police and soldiers with their rifles at the ready, and they were shooting people and killing them. And I don't know what gave me the idea, but I looked sideways. I saw an officer, a German officer, who was obviously in charge. He was a lieutenant. I don't know how I know that, but he was a lieutenant. And he looked as though he was in charge. He wasn't doing anything. He had plenty of helpers. And I went up to him without being noticed, obviously. And I said, "I've been separated from my father and brother. Can I go back to them? They're in the ghetto." And he looked flabbergasted. And he actually, I remember his face. He had a pleasant face, kind face. And he actually called over a policeman and said, "Take her back inside the ghetto." Now, on the way, I said, "Just a minute, I've got to get my cousin." And the policeman said, "You can't, because she hasn't had permission." So I was faced with this dilemma. And I always, when I speak about it, I always ask people to try and imagine what would they do? Because the Holocaust was full of these dilemmas. I mean, I wasn't alone. But it was awful. What was I to do? To lose the chance of being reunited with Ben and father, or leave my cousin to her devices? It was a terrible, terrible moment for me. But I kept on arguing with this policeman. He was a Jewish policeman. And then suddenly he said, you know, quickly take her and go. And we're back with the working party. So then we were transferred to this very big place where they made plywood. And I became a laborer. I worked in the factory. Anne didn't because she was far too young, but I was with the women in the barracks at one end of this enormous compound. My father and Ben were with the men. We didn't see one another often because it was a very large place, but we did see one another. And my father was still able to supplement our very meager rations because he had still connections outside. And there we worked for a bit more than 18 months when we were finally deported.
And then you were deported to Ravensbrück, right?
Yeah, and the men too.
I'm going to skip, forgive me, I'm very conscious of time and I want to cover it.
Okay.
So you went from Ravensbrück and then you went to Bergen-Belsen, and there is where Simon said you were liberated by British officers in Bergen-Belsen with your young cousin.
Mm-hmm.
And then what was your experience at the end of the war? How were you liberated?
Well, when we arrived in Bergen-Belsen, it was very overcrowded. And this is well known because they were pushing people from Poland into Germany, from the camps in Poland into camps in Germany. And when we arrived there, they were so overcrowded that they didn't have room for us. So they put us up in a tent overnight. The next morning, they let us in, and I just very briefly tell you what I saw, which is ingrained on my mind, is first of all a terrible smell and a smog, and people who were like skeletons. They were like zombies shuffling along aimlessly, and they'll just collapse and die. And there were dead bodies everywhere. And there were piles of naked, twisted, decaying corpses. It was a horrific sight. On the way to the barracks, we were also very overcrowded. I just heard by chance that there is a children's home somewhere in the camp, and I very quickly diverted to look for it with Anne, and they wouldn't take us in at first. That's another long story, but eventually they did. And that really saved us because we would not have survived on the main camp in Bergen-Belsen.
And then at that stage, you knew that what did you know about your brother and your father?
Nothing, but I'll tell you that when we arrived in Bergen-Belsen, there were a lot of camps within that very large area in that forest. And they were sort of divided by barbed wire. And one would always run to the barbed wire to see whether, to ask people, which camp are you in? Where do you come from? Did you see my father or brother by any chance? And I did that every time I could. But when, even in this home in Bergen-Belsen, minutely better conditions, I still succumbed to typhus. I was lying on my bunk when I must have got over the worst because I was conscious, and I suddenly saw people running, and that was, didn't know where or why, but I thought, how did they have the strength? That was the 15th of April when we're liberated. And at that point, I had no idea who survived and who didn't.
And so you were alone with your cousin at the end of the war. You didn't know, most of your family had not survived. Your brother Ben subsequently found out that his father, your father, was shot almost at the very end of the war. You didn't know that he was dead. You also didn't know Ben was alive. You were taken to Sweden. Who took you to Sweden after the war? And what happened there?
Well, Sweden opened their gates to refugees and children, and they were really wonderful. I went with a group of children. I don't know how many. There may have been about 200 or 300. I don't know the numbers. And the Swedes were wonderful towards us. It was July, it was summertime holiday. So they sent us to sort of resort places by the lakes so that we were really recovering. We weren't doing anything, but ultimately they organized sort of schools for us, but they weren't the normal schools. They were the schools for refugees. And I was with children my age, and we started some schooling but then I was separated from Anne because at liberation, she was 7 years old and I was 14. And that's all right to be together, but at a school, you wouldn't put a 14-year with a 7-year-old.
No.
So we were separated. And while during the war, she was so terrified of losing me. She wouldn't leave me out of her sight. But once the war was over, she shed that fear so quickly. And she was quite happy to be with children her own age. And ultimately were separated. We were corresponding and were always in touch. So, and her mother had survived as well. But we didn't know it then.
How did you discover that your brother Ben had survived?
Well, I'm trying to establish that because he remembers much better than I do. And he is the one who found out. And I want to know specifically.
Because he was liberated in Theresienstadt and came with a group of 732 survivors to the United Kingdom, sponsored by the Central British Fund, which is now World Jewish Relief, and they became the boys. But you were not part of that. So how did you find out you were? How did you find out you were alive?
You know, my brother Ben, your father Ben, he was always very enterprising. And he went back to Poland under those conditions. As soon as he was liberated, he traveled back to Poland, to Piotrków, to see who survived. And he met somebody who had seen me in Bergen-Belsen after the war. So he knew then that I had survived. But after that, a lot of more information came to light, and it happened bit by bit.
So he knew you were alive, but he didn't know where you were. He then went to England. He was learning English. He was establishing a place in England. When and how did you then connect?
Well, the committee here that looked after the boys, they, you know, I was really very lucky throughout because I always had the right help and the right people looked after me. And I didn't make any decisions. They were always made for me and they happened to turn out right. So the committee here had learned that he's got a sister and she's in Sweden. And they decided that it would be best for me to travel from Sweden to London to be reunited with Ben. And that's effectively what happened. I mean, we were corresponding all the way throughout that time.
So it was some months after the war that they identified you, and then you got a letter from Ben, or?
Yes, I got a letter from Ben, and I remember the letter. I remember it arriving. I opened it, and I was so excited that I ran out into the grounds. This was a building we're in, which is like a stately home, stripped of its beauty, but this was our school, like a boarding school, and beautiful grounds. And I ran out, sort of waving this letter in the air, saying, I've got a letter from my brother. I was very excited. And of course, there was all the more subsequently when I came to England. That was
you came at that stage. You were what, about 17 years old, 18 years old?
No, I was 16.
16 years old. And,
yes.
And how did you establish yourself? You met Dad. I mean, he was not much more than a year older than you.
Yeah.
So he was also a teenager just trying to establish himself. Where did you live? How did you establish yourself?
Well, it was always the help of that committee, and they were wonderful. And I've got all the papers, you know, they became available after so many years from the committee, what they said, how they did it. So I've got a whole chronology of what happened when I came to England. But basically, they were very helpful in every way. I was sharing a room with a girl that was already living here. I went to learn English, which very quickly, because and I learned it quickly, not because I'm clever, I'm not, but I knew that without it, I won't get anywhere. So I learned quickly I learned English within about a couple of months, and I started a course, a secretarial course in a secretarial school. And after a year, I was working and I was self-supporting. And
then you met Maurice
Then
Tribich,
I met Maurice.
my Uncle Maurice.
And that was the best thing that ever happened to me in my life.
And he had served in the British forces himself, hadn't he?
Yeah. And you know, he used to, you probably don't know this through the family, but he always used to say, I came to England at the same time as Marla. It was almost suggesting that he was also a foreigner had come to England, but he was actually the mob. And I thought he always tried to identify with me any way he could. And and I thought, well, he's just saying it. But after he died, and I was going through the papers, and he did arrive in England from the army in a big ship, the same date as I came to England. It's just coincidence.
Oh, beautiful coincidence. And what, Auntie Marla, very few people survived. Very few children survived. Very, very, very few girls survived. What do you think was different from you for your experience being a woman, being a girl, being a woman during the Holocaust, and then in particular establishing yourself when you came to England?
I really don't know. I mean, I can't say that. I just always think I was very lucky. People have always been very nice to me, and I somehow always ended up in the right place at the right time. Sheer luck. But well, when I came to England, there was this group here, so I had friends. But the first thing I did actually, once I started working, or before I even worked, I joined some Jewish organizations. Habonim was the first one, and that was wonderful. I had lovely friends. And then I joined, then I switched to Young Palais Zion. I don't know if people even know it today. And there I met more lovely people, including Maurice. So that was really...
So it was a left-wing, a Labour Zionist, basically. It's through Labour Zionist youth movements that you met.
Yeah.
I'm conscious that I really wanted to balance the experience that you had during the war with your experiences after and now, and I haven't really done a great job because there's so much to say in such a short time. But I wonder if I could just squeeze a few more minutes in, and Simon, message me if I can't. I want to have a sense of, at the beginning, you dived into your...
You most certainly can.
Okay, thank you very much. Give me an idea how much longer then.
5 minutes is fine.
Great. Okay. Thank you. So you established you were a young woman. You got married. You had 2 children, my cousins Shannon and Jeffrey. You were working in secretarial, and then subsequently you went and studied, didn't you? You went and did a degree.
Yeah. Yes, I did a degree in sociology, and I haven't really used it, which is a pity, but I thought that I needed a little education. I had missed out such a lot. And also some of the things people, well, once I married Maurice, I sort of came into a Jewish family, Jewish English family who had been here a very long time. My mother-in-law was born here. My father-in-law came when he was a young man of 18. And there were 3 sisters. And I sort of felt absorbed by this family. And I entered the sort of British way of life, the way they lived. They were sort of moderately religious. And I had a sort of typical Jewish English life, which I loved, and eventually we sort of got out on our own and we made our way. It's been very difficult, it hasn't been easy, but everything we've achieved has been our own doing, except that we had this sort of lovely, Maurice's lovely family background, which was wonderful for me. Looking back, I think that accounted a lot for the way things went afterwards.
And at the beginning, when you came to England, a lot of the boys said that they didn't talk much about the Holocaust. It wasn't something that British Jewry wanted to talk about. It wasn't something that that wider society wanted to talk about. The war had been hard on everybody. There was rationing. People needed to get on. And it was only in much later life when they established themselves in the 70s and then the 80s, led in very great part by your brother Ben, and that Holocaust memorialization and talking about it became something that was done. What was your journey from your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, your 50s and on? How did you get involved and when?
Well, I can see what I understand what you're saying about the Holocaust. It wasn't talked about at first. And sometimes I felt, well, people are not really interested or they don't want to know. I didn't give it too much thought. I was busy establishing my own life. But I can tell you, and there isn't time to tell you, that why I can see very clearly why this happened and how it happened. Because when we didn't talk about the Holocaust, that was the time not to talk. You know, there is in the Bible, there's a saying, there's a time for everything, and there's a time to talk and a time to be silent. And that wasn't the time for talking about the Holocaust, because people were sort of building their own lives. People came back from the army, they had very little, they had problems, there was no work, no accommodation. There were great difficulties, things were tough. So when they're going to talk about the Holocaust, they had problems. Everybody had problems. So, the right time came. And of course, Ben he's done an awful lot to sort of put it on the agenda, so to speak. And because at first people weren't that interested, but we know now how interested they are, and it had to take its course.
And what's interesting is I have this sense, and I have this sense that you came to actively speaking and teaching about the Holocaust later in life. But in fact, one of the speeches that I have from you, this is the second time I've interviewed you. The first time I interviewed you was with Dad when I was 15 years old, and we did a video.
I haven't seen my bit, and that's why
and then in the speech that you shared with me is from 1996. So even though relatively later in life you did it, you've been doing this now for at least 25 years.
Mm.
What gives you the strength to keep driving on? And you're committed. You're all over the country. You're all over the world. You're still determined to tell this story. And it's not a secret how old you are, because I said you were born in September 1930. So what gives you the strength to carry on?
Well, I know that was so short of time, but you know, I started quite early because I mean, my week, so people wanted me to give a talk, and I sure wanted me, and it was long before people started talking. So over the years, but now it's got much more intense, and I really feel very strongly that it is so important that people, you know, hear the story and that they know about it. For one thing, there's great interest and people want to listen. The pity of it is that it's at the end of the Holocaust survivors, so they have to listen to films and tapes and other people who weren't in it. But I feel that with the anti-Semitism that's going on today, it is more important than ever that we've got to be strong and defend our position. And the Holocaust, I think, explains it in a way that it shows what can happen when a civilization breaks down and when there is prejudice and discrimination. And so I feel very strongly that we've got to go on as long as we can talking.
Thank you very much indeed, Auntie Mala. I've got one final question for you, and before I hand over to Simon, and that is, not many people know, I think, that you are an extremely keen gardener.
Oh, yes.
and you love to spend your time pottering around your terrace and tending and growing your amazing plants.
Mm.
Is that something that you've always done, or has that come more recently?
No, it's more recent. I mean, for a long time, ever since we had a house, I started then. But now I do enjoy it very much, and especially during this lockdown, I have been sort of always out there on my roof garden, tending to my plants and really enjoying it.
Well, you've always been an extraordinary loving and nurturing aunt to me and to my brothers, and everybody loves you and admires you tremendously. And I think we haven't really done justice to your story now, or just a glimpse in your life, but your incredible energy and equanimity and strength and purpose is just wonderful. And thank you very much for continuing to answer questions and to tell a very, very important story.
Thank you. Shall I have the last word? No, I'll leave it at that and say thank you.
Thank you, Mala, for sharing your life's experience with us. Mala, you are an inspiration. Despite your tragic wartime experiences, you always display such youthful energy and zest for life. It really is such a privilege to hear you share your personal story of life, loss, and survival. And thank you also, Maurice, for facilitating such a fascinating conversation, highlighting important aspects of Mala's life story. As her nephew, you're probably very familiar with your family history, but telling it to others is definitely not an easy task. We really appreciate your time and effort here this evening. Whilst you're in conversation, we have got one question from Normie Loppian, which I'm going to ask my Esther to share with you.
Hi Mala, thank you so much. It was really, really wonderful conversation between the two of you. I particularly like the personal aspect of it, the fact that you are Maurice's aunt, and there's obviously such a closeness between you. The question from Normie Loppian is, even though post-war society weren't that interested in listening to Holocaust survivors initially, how did you deal with your trauma immediately after the war? And did you tell your children your story? And at what age did you tell them your story?
Yeah, that's very interesting, because really, I need an hour to tell you, but I did not tell my children. I never told. If it came, you know, came into a conversation, okay, I would answer if I was asked something, but I never sat down my children and said, listen, I was in a concentration camp. You've got to listen to this. It is sort of permeated through my family in a gentle way. When it was relevant, we talked about it. When it wasn't, we didn't. And I know my daughter told me at some point that she said she was reading avidly about the Holocaust because she knew that I had been she knew a little bit about me. So she read up an awful lot. And the rest came gradually. It's all sort of happened naturally in a way. So I never sat down my children like some people did and say, listen to my story. But they're very knowledgeable, and Jeffrey, my son, is knowledgeable to the extent that he's even been on a course to Yad Vashem. So, and Shannon, my daughter, is also very through reading and going to every film and or meeting that she's able to go to. And it's been with us, with my family, but not in a way where I would sort of make them feel it, because there's so much to say about it. Because this is other people's story, and I've read about it. And this was a very famous film producer in Israel. He said his mother had been through the concentration camp, so she's always reminding him. So he comes home from school, and he said, "Mom, I've got 7 for my arithmetic," and she said, "7? For 7, I had to survive Auschwitz." There was this, and this is actually true. Another time he came home and said, "Oh, it's so hot outside," and this is in Israel. So she said, "Hot? You don't know what hot is. The crematoria, that's hot."
Yeah.
So I mean, it's but people have pumped into their children. But ours is sort of taken its course as and when, and they do know an awful lot about the Holocaust. But I haven't pushed it at them, not at any time. And what was the other part of the question? I can't remember.
How did you yourself deal with the trauma initially, if you didn't talk about it till later on?
Well, initially I was with people who had been through the same thing, and we were in a way a sort of comfort to one another. We didn't talk, we sort of were quite positive. I think that, well, the different feelings on that, but I think that young people are more resilient, and it's easier for them to adapt and adjust and overcome things than older people. Some people think it's the other way around. Everybody's got different views on it, but I think that my saving has been my marriage to a most wonderful man. And I'm not just saying it. I mean, Maurice will bear it out because he loved his Uncle Maurice, because Maurice loved children.
Also, not only did I love him, but he had a wonderful zest for life and a spirit, and he wasn't a comedian, but he was always cracking a joke and keeping things light. He liked to have fun.
Yeah. So I was very lucky there. I also had his family. You know, things work out one way or another. Well, they either do or they don't. I mean, I know of some very tragic stories, but I think I was very lucky, and I just have this belief that young people are more resilient and more adaptable, and it's easier to make a new life. But people who are already established and lose their families, and it's just dreadful. They can never get over it. So I attribute perhaps my young age to a sort of recovery being that much easier to cope with.
Well, we've spent an hour together, so we've kind of come to the end of our time. A huge thank you to you, Mala. Thank you, Maurice. And thank you to all of us who have been here together this evening. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you, Simon.